Hello, this is video number 2 for the digestive system, and in this video we're going to continue on covering digestive system anatomy. Last time we finished off talking about the 4 different layers that make up the wall of the alimentary canal, and I want to pick up with that and talk a little bit about the main functions for those layers, and then we'll move on to talk about the different types of membranes that are found especially in the abdominal cavity. That's the site where most of the digestive organs are located. And so we'll talk about those membranes as well. So just to review from the first video, the 4 main layers of the wall of the alimentary canal shown here. Innermost mucosal membrane that has 3 sublayers. Supporting that is the submucosal membrane, the Muscularis layer, and the Serosa. And that's Serosa is one of the membranes that we'll talk about. And that's covering all the abdominal organs. For the esophagus, similar membrane coating it, but it's called the adventitia. So let's go through the main functions for these different layers. For the mucosal layer, this is lining the inside. So this is in contact with the contents of the lumen. The mucosal layer is going to be doing a lot of secretion. And just exactly what is secreted depends on where in the digestive tract we're talking about. But there will be a lot of mucus, water, digestive enzymes in some locations, and even some hormones. And also not on the list, acid in the stomach, for example. Because the mucosal membrane is in contact with the contents of the lumen, that's also where absorption is taking place. So the process of absorption is going to move material across the mucosal membrane and eventually into bloodstream or other vessels called lymphatic vessels. Mucosal membrane is also involved in protection. It's a barrier between what you ingest and the actual interior of the body. And the protection can involve things like if you ingest a toxin or a pathogen, a bacterium or a virus. That barrier, as long as it remains intact, can help you get rid of it. Oftentimes, if you ingest a toxin, that triggers the vomiting reflex, and you get rid of it that way. Or diarrhea actually is a protective function as well, which speeds transit of harmful substances through the digestive tract. These are the 3 sublayers of the mucosal layer: innermost epithelium, the lamina propria, which is a loose connective tissue supporting the epithelium, and a thin muscularis mucosae, which is surrounding the lamina propria. This slide is illustrating one of the functions of the mucosal membrane, and here we're looking at the mucosal epithelium. And here are substances that have been digested and now are small enough to absorb. And these blobs could be any of the building blocks, for example, amino acids from protein digestion or fatty acids from lipid digestion. They are going to travel across the epithelium and enter into the lamina propria. So they've left the lumen. And then once they're in the lamina propria, these are the 2 main destinations, either the bloodstream, most absorbed nutrients end up in the bloodstream, or in a lymphatic capillary. We haven't talked about these yet, but that's another way to circulate fluids and substances dissolved in them in the body. Okay? So absorption, one of the main functions of the mucosal membrane. Second layer, the submucosal layer. The main functions for this layer: it's a pathway for all kinds of substances coming through blood vessels or lymphatic vessels like the capillary that we just saw. That's how it reaches the mucosal layer. And also for nerve fibers and what are called lymphoid nodules. These are protective immune cells, basically, packets of them. Submucosa also has some glands that do secretion, for example, for mucus and other substances. It's not as active in secretion as the mucosal layer, but it does play a role in that function. Muscularis externa is the third layer from the inside, and the main functions for this is, since it's made up of smooth muscle, contraction gives motility. It pushes contents through the digestive tract. And I have a slide illustrating these two, peristalsis and mixing, and we'll come to that in a minute. The other main function of the muscularis is, in certain places in the digestive tract, it's much thicker than in most places. And that thickening basically closes off the pathway. And when that thickened area, called a sphincter, is contracted, the pathway is closed. But these sphincter muscles can relax, opening the pathway. So that allows regulation of flow of the contents through different areas. So there are, I think, 5 or 6 sphincters that we'll talk about along the digestive tract. All right, this slide is showing mixing and propulsion due to contraction of the muscularis layer. Mixing is a type of mechanical digestion in which, mostly homogenized material can be further mixed and a little bit pummeled into smaller bits. And this is mostly happening in the small intestine. And basically it's going to be contracting different segments of the wall. And that's going to cause movement of the contents in these different segments to mix with neighboring segments. Propulsion by peristalsis is shown on this slide, and basically a wave of contraction of the circular layer is going to push the contents forward. This doesn't show that there's also contraction of the longitudinal layer, which is shortening the tube. So this pushing and shortening causes the contents to move along the tube. The outermost layer is the serosa for segments in the abdomen, or the adventitia for the esophagus. And you can just think of this as a protective wrapping for the most part. So this is protecting the alimentary canal and, kind of keeping it intact. The serosa layer plays an additional function. And that is, it's wrapping around the segment, let's say the small intestine, it wraps around it, and then it extends from that segment to attach to the body wall. And this helps to anchor the organ to the body wall. So anchoring is another important function. And this attachment is called the mesentery, and I'll describe that more in a bit. Okay, let's talk about the main linings that you'll find in the digestive system, and these are, this discussion will be restricted to the abdominal cavity. So if you look at the organs in the abdominal cavity, and those are the segments of the alimentary canal, including the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and accessory organs, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. Those are covered by serous membranes. In the abdominal cavity, they're called the peritoneal membranes, and the peritoneum is a double layer. All serous membranes come in pairs. You have an inner membrane, the visceral peritoneum, and that's going to form the coating on the surface of all of the organs. And then you have a parietal layer, parietal peritoneum, is lining the inside of the abdominal cavity. So stuck to the inside of the body wall, both anterior, posterior, and also lateral parts of that body wall. Now, these two membranes are usually right up against each other. The abdomen is really tightly packed with these organs, and the visceral peritoneum is, right up against the parietal peritoneum. And these membranes secrete a fluid, serous fluid, and that's going to help lubricate these organs as they sit in your abdominal cavity. So the space between these is actually not typically a real space. It's a potential space, but it's called the peritoneal cavity. These membranes are able to, you can separate them. And the peritoneal cavity is containing the serous fluid. All right, and the other membrane is the mesentery, and as I mentioned, that is a membrane that's extending from the organ. The visceral peritoneum wraps around the organ, and then it exits from the organ to form two layers, which are going to extend to the body wall and attach the organ to the body wall. Now, the mesentery is a sandwich because it has two layers. And between the layers are a number of structures, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves connecting to the organ. So this slide shows it's an exaggeration of the peritoneal cavity here. This is a gross exaggeration of it, just to show there is a potential space between the parietal peritoneal membrane, which is lining the body wall, dorsal and ventral here. And here is the visceral peritoneum covering, let's say this is the small intestine. Okay, the visceral peritoneum is going to surround, I'll cover the surface of the tube, and then it's going to extend away, both two layers here. That's the mesentery. The mesentery can attach to the dorsal body wall. That's called the dorsal mesentery, or it can attach to the ventral body wall, called a ventral mesentery. In some cases, there are organs that are connected and anchored in series. Dorsal mesentery, some section of the alimentary canal, and a mesentery that's linking, let's say, the small intestine to the liver, and then the liver is connected by ventral mesentery to the ventral body wall. Okay, so those are the main structures that are involved: peritoneal membranes and mesentery. A little bit more about the mesenteries. So this is a mid-sagittal section of the trunk of the body, mostly the abdomen shown here. And in this view, this kind of pictorial view, we can see some of the main organs: liver, stomach, part of the large intestine, small intestine, and pancreas is also shown there. And so this illustrates the mesenteries pretty well. So here is a mesentery linking the large intestine, it's called the greater omentum, the stomach. The greater omentum links the stomach to part of the large intestine, and that's also linked to the posterior or dorsal body wall. So there's a dorsal mesentery, and these all have different names. I don't expect you to know the individual names. Dorsal mesentery and a connecting mesentery, greater omentum, linking the large intestine to the stomach. And that's also linked to the liver. For the small intestine, that's the longest tube, and there's a very extensive set of mesenteries linking the different segments to the dorsal body wall. Okay, so when you did your cat or mink dissection, you probably noticed this in the abdominal cavity, especially this when you first open the abdominal cavity. You see this ribbon, basically, or curtain, I guess you could say, of tissue that's covering all the organs. So that is the greater omentum, sort of draped on all of these organs. Right, so the mesenteries are linking organs and they're anchoring them to the body wall. This is important because if you think about a 20-foot tube, which the small intestine is, and if you think about charging cords, if they sit in a bag that you have or in your home, you know, they become tangled very easily and it's a mess. What we don't want is for our intestines to become entangled like that, because if they become entangled, then they could knot and close off the pathway, and that's not a good thing. All right, there's one other thing I want to mention about this slide, and that's the terms shown on the left here, intraperitoneal versus retroperitoneal. Most of the abdominal organs and the digestive organs in the abdomen are intraperitoneal. These organs are covered by a visceral peritoneum, and they have surrounding them the peritoneal cavity, which is between the visceral peritoneum and the parietal peritoneum. Okay, so liver, stomach, large intestine, most but not all of the small intestine are intraperitoneal. Okay, some organs, however, are retroperitoneal. Retroperitoneal literally means behind the peritoneal cavity. And those organs are basically embedded in the dorsal body wall. They're not covered by a visceral peritoneum. They may be partly covered by a parietal peritoneum. So examples of organs that have a retroperitoneal location, and these are just digestive organs, part of the pancreas, part of the small intestine called the duodenum is located there, a retroperitoneal location. Okay, the next few slides are just showing the mesentery. Here is a mesentery from a cadaver, and this is showing the greater omentum that has been pulled back here. When you first open up the abdominal cavity, this would be draped over all of these organs. Greater omentum is attached to stomach and one segment of the large intestine called the transverse colon. Okay, there's another mesentery that's connecting this same segment to the dorsal body wall. Here is the extensive mesentery connecting all of the small intestine also to the dorsal body wall. Okay. And this is just a pictorial showing basically the same thing with the main names of these mesenteries. Again, I don't expect you to know the names. I expect you to know the concept of the mesentery, what it does, connects segments of the alimentary canal to the dorsal or the ventral body wall or to each other. That stabilizes them and prevents them from being entangled with each other. It also is a pathway for blood vessels, nerve fibers to travel from the body wall out to these organs. Another function is, you probably have noticed in your dissection, these are locations for fat storage, and so you see adipose tissue associated with these mesenteries as well. All right, I'm going to end the video here. The next set of videos, we will start traveling through the different segments of the alimentary canal. And for each of them, I'm going to break them down in terms of main anatomy and histology and the main functions of each. See you later.